Hi, I'm Malcolm Stern, and in conjunction with my friends John and Sandra Wilson from Online Events, we're creating a series of podcasts called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion. My book of the same name was conceived and inspired by the suicide of my daughter Melissa and the journey that took me on and the internal resources that I found. All of my guests will have a story to tell around overcoming and ultimately thriving through adversity. Special thanks to the band Stairway, Jim McCarty and Louis Chinamo, for the use of theme music from their album Medicine Dance, and my engineer Owen Santiago. I hope you enjoy this series, and thanks for listening. So, welcome to Slay Your Dragons with Compassion podcast, which I'm doing in conjunction with my friends at Online Events. I'm getting a range of guests who have had extraordinary experiences and who've made something of their lives through overcoming adversity. And today I'm talking to a very old friend, Alex Howard. And Alex, we met through your wonderful TV channel, Conscious Life. Is it Conscious Life? Yeah.
Conscious Life, yeah. It started off as a YouTube channel, now as an online platform. But yeah, that's where we first got to know each other, back when you were sort of doing alternatives, and we had some nice collaborations together.
We did. We had some lovely stuff. And I've sort of watched you sort of like evolve yourself. I think I've watched you develop your work so that you're actually right out there, specializing in things like trauma, and obviously you've been through your own experiences that have helped you get there. So give us a brief update of what you're doing right now. What's happening in your life right now?
So where I am these days, in my work life, I run a clinic. So clinic that I started over 20 years ago, specializing in complex chronic illnesses, fatigue-related conditions, trauma, anxiety, and so on. We run a lot of online conferences. So we've done events, similar subjects. So our trauma event, I think we've had now about 2 million people that have attended our online trauma event. And my sort of personal, so I run the businesses, but I also have my own work as a teacher. My kind of great passion with that is I have a YouTube series called In Therapy, where we film people's therapeutic journeys and then we share those on YouTube. And really my hope with that is really two things. Number one, to demystify therapy. And so for people that, you and I live in a world where it's the most normal thing in the world to go and see a therapist. That's not everyone's world. So to demystify therapy, but also for those that can't access one-on-one therapy, I hear a lot of people say that following other people's journeys, they get a lot from seeing those journeys. And so that's also an important part of my work these days.
So I see that very much in groups, that actually people learn by osmosis. So someone will do a piece of work in the group, it'll trigger something, and actually the work will get done by the observer as well as the person who's in there. And so is your series anything like In Treatment, which was obviously the TV series, which Gabriel Byrne as the therapist?
Do you know what? It's very funny. I've never seen In Treatment, but my wife, when it first came out, was around the time we first got together, and I remember her just completely utterly obsessed by In Treatment. So I don't, because I haven't seen it. I don't know how similar it is. I think it's the thing that. So people sometimes ask how similar is it to Esther Perel, has an excellent podcast that many people will be aware of. The thing that we do that's different there is we actually follow the journeys through. So rather than doing single sessions with different people, we'll film sort of 8 to 10 sessions with somebody, and then we'll show session by session the progression and the journey that person goes on.
Very interesting, and people are able to show themselves in that environment, despite the fact that they're being filmed.
It's interesting. There's a certain self-selection process that someone comes in knowing that that's what's going to happen. We've worked very hard in recent series to not get people that are just in my ecosystem that think, oh, I just want to have a chance to work with Alex. So we have a TV casting person. There's these people that basically go and find people for TV shows, and sometimes they find us people that want to be on reality TV shows. Well, it's not quite what we do.
Yes.
But we've had some amazing people that have come in. And what they often say is for the first 5 or 10 minutes, they're really aware of the fact they're being filmed. And then we have We only have two crew in the studio, so we're very careful to not have, like a normal TV situation, you'd have 10, 12 people in the room. So we're very careful to make it feel personal and intimate. But once people are in the zone, they just, yeah, they pretty much forget the cameras. And it's amazing the work that people end up doing.
Yes. So that's your work has changed considerably over the years. So you started off with the clinic, which was very much about. I think it got. I remember a conversation we'd had where you'd had your own health trauma, and that had sort of driven you towards the clinic. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I was diagnosed with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome when just around the time I turned 16 years old. I had I suppose the technical term was complex childhood. I had my father left soon after I was born. I had a sister with quite serious mental health issues. Um, and when I was first diagnosed with ME chronic fatigue, of course, initially one thinks, oh, well, yeah, I remember that the doctor saying, "Oh, well, it might take sort of 6 months for you to feel better," and that seemed like the end of the world when you're 16 years old. 6 months.
It's
I think
forever.
if you told me it was going to be 7 years, I think I'm not sure how I would have handled that. But a couple of years in, I'd got worse. I mean, I had obviously severe fatigue, muscle pains, dizziness, headaches. I'd be exhausted all day, and then I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. And I reached a point where I don't think I was particularly exactly planning how I was going to end my life, but I certainly reached the point where I didn't want to live anymore the way that it was. Because after 2 years and things getting worse, not better, it seemed like, well, this is just going to be the rest of my life. And I had a conversation that, and we have these kind of moments in our life where you look back and you realize that your whole life really changed. And I don't know, like, if those moments, maybe we can have a separate conversation on this. If those moments are just the grace of God that, like, something happens and the right person, the right conversation at the right time. But I had a conversation where I was basically helped to realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to change, if I waited for someone else to change it, I could be waiting the rest of my life. And I was helped to realize that although I had every right to feel like a victim, because we're in our own way, we're all victims of the circumstance that we're in, and that was an entirely valid place to feel, but that wouldn't change anything. And if I wanted things to change, then I was going to have to do something. And I had all kinds of reasons why I couldn't do that. I was 18 years old. I knew nothing about medicine. I didn't even do very well at science at school. I didn't have energy. I didn't have money. Like, I had no resources to be able to do something. And what I was helped to realize I did have one resource, which I had time. And I was spending 7 hours a day watching television. And this was like 1998. So, I mean, you'll remember what TV was like back in 1998. We had 4 channels. Channel
Yeah.
5 hadn't been launched.
No
And
Netflix
and
either.
so this wasn't like 7 hours a TV a day now doesn't sound too bad between Netflix and Amazon. There's a lot of good TV shows to be watched, and I always felt like I'm behind the curve. But in those days, we're talking about crappy soap operas that are on twice a day. And remember, they had the omnibus on the Sunday where they'd
Oh
replay
yes.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'll be there for the omnibus as well. Um, and so I was helped to realize that if I spent that time proactively working on my health, and things like meditation, yoga, nutrition, psychology, reading books. This was back in the day. You had to go to the local library and sort of being 18 years old and ordering books on self-love from the local library was. I think I'd have felt braver ordering porn magazines or something. It was not an easy thing to go and do, but I read a number of books that really started to change my perception. And I really spent the next 5 years on a very determined, at times obsessive healing journey. And I didn't find, I was thinking, I've got to find the answer. And what I realized is there isn't an answer. There's lots of answers, and there's a jigsaw with lots of pieces, and one has to figure out how to put those pieces together. And having done that and got back to full health, Um, I was, so at this point, I was sort of 22 years old. I'd just finished a degree in psychology. I'd done some training in sort of psychotherapeutic and NLP approaches. And I was like, well, I'm not going to go and get a normal job now. And so I ended up setting up the clinic that I wanted to exist in the years that I'd been ill. And that, yeah, that's what, many things have happened since then. But that was really the heart of what I've been doing for this last 20 something years.
That's interesting because it seems like your adversity educated you. It
Yeah.
forced you into a place where you were having to understand the process by which you were going to be able to move through it. And then from that, and I think this is really important for us as well, is that you then felt an obligation to let that be available for others, or you found yourself letting it be a resource for others as well. And I'd heard of your clinic long before I'd heard of you as well, that actually there was a sense that you were doing some quite powerful work around alternative medicine as well. And well, you probably wouldn't call it that, but I don't know what you would call it, Alex. But
We certainly would have fallen in that category back in those days.
back in those
We've
days,
become a bit more. So I wouldn't say mainstream, but we've certainly become more integrated over the years. But it's interesting. I just want to respond to something you said, because this is such an alive debate in my own sort of life and mind these days, which is that the potential for adversity to be our teacher. Because I think about this a lot, particularly as a parent. And I think about, I have three kids, three girls between 7 and 13. And of course, the constant instinct as a parent is that you don't want your children to suffer. You don't want them to struggle. And having had quite a difficult childhood, I don't want them to have struggle and difficulty. And then it's been very alive in my mind recently, because I noticed a few times where I'd sort of see my kids sort of being a bit like lazy, or sort of taking shortcuts around things like homework. And of course, I was very guilty of the same thing. So I
of
don't,
course. Yes.
in no ways I want to be kind of unfair about it. But I also realized that almost everything in my life that I value has come through a certain amount of struggle. And, I think about that even in terms of my relationship with my wife. It's like one has to work at a relationship. And it's like the things that we take for granted in our lives, the things we don't invest heart and energy into, the places where we're not willing to be called out on our sort of flaws or our areas, are often the areas which cause us the most pain and suffering. And I realized that so many of the things that I love to do, the things that bring me great joy because I spent a few decades getting good at them, because I had to struggle,
Yes.
I it's a very difficult conversation as a therapist, or as a mentor, or as a friend with someone, when they're going through really hard stuff. And the last thing they want to hear is someone going, "This is really great," because this is
Exactly.
where the good stuff comes. And yet there is just a truth to that.
And I think we become bigger through our suffering if we choose to be, or it swamps us. And what I've seen is that actually you've developed, you've ridden on it and you've developed it. And I think what you were saying before is really interesting, that actually anything that really matters involves effort. So for example, any idiot can fall in love. And suddenly you're there and you don't have to do anything. You're with the beloved.
And we've all been the idiot falling in love, haven't we?
Yeah, that's right. But then there's the practice of relationship, which we're not taught very much about, and we have to learn as we go. But it's a real commitment. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, without having to sort of divulge details you don't want to particularly, how that's manifested for you in your relationship with your wife.
Yeah, well, I think, so we have three kids, three daughters, different forms of neurodiversity. Our eldest daughter has very severe dyslexia, which has meant she's in a special educational needs school, and has, had a tough journey with that, although she's incredible the way that she's navigated it. I have a pretty complex and demanding sort of work life and schedule. Just last night, it's like, I can't make parents' evening because they give us 3 weeks notice, and my schedule gets booked 2 years ahead sometimes. And it's like, and so sort of the day-to-day complexity of how do you work as a team? And, when I'm at work, I have 70 staff across the businesses, I hope I never behave like the petulant boss that gets what he wants when he wants it. But there is a sort of reality that if I click my fingers, something needs to happen, there's a good chance that thing's going to happen. That's a really bad way to approach a marriage, or to approach kind of life at home. And so, the sort of the navigation of those different places, and what I find is, the heart to me of a good marriage is, how do we work together as a team? How do I see you? How do you see me? How do we invest in this thing which is us, and not let us only be defined by children or roles or responsibilities? But of course, when one's depleted in themselves, the last thing they want to do is put energy into someone else. And so it's just navigating all of those demands and those complexities and those challenges. Um, and what being able to not just be reactive. And one of the things I talk a lot about in my work is the sort of, I talk about there being two truths. There's the truth of one's adult rational perspective, one's responsibilities, being a sort of mature husband, wife, whatever. And there's a second truth, which is one's childlike emotional impulses, feelings, responses. And so when one feels unseen or doesn't get what they want in that moment, or feels that they're taking too much of the response, whatever it may be, one has all their reactions. And that's the childlike place is to respond from there. The adult place is to be rational, reasonable. But if one hides in that place and one's not being emotionally available, that's also a problem.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
like that dance and that balancing of those places is always a working edge. For me, it's like, how do I advocate for what I need? But
Yeah.
how do I also recognize that, what does my wife need? What do my children need? How do I avoid going into my kind of helper achiever over responsible pattern where I'm trying to rescue everyone? But also, how do I avoid swinging to the other extreme where I'm like, well, I've given too much, so I'm now checking out and unavailable. Like, all of these delicate balances.
So one of the models that I've used in when I've worked with relationships is that you need to connect at an emotional, physical, spiritual, and emotional, physical, spiritual, and intellectual level. How would you say that that functions for you in your marriage? Are there connections at all those levels?
I think you should ask my wife.
I should ask her that. Yes.
I think there's certainly that intention for that. I would
Yeah.
say yes, yeah,
Yes.
and I think what was really important. I had quite a lot of disastrous or failed relationships before I met my wife, and I realized that the thing that was most important to me, and I think for different people it's different. I'm not saying this is how it is for everyone, but what for me was the most important thing was that when it came down to it, at the most important things, we would be values aligned. And so we've both been on a sincere spiritual path for many years, and that's a really important thing, which gets a very high priority in terms of sort of relationship. We have very similar values when it comes to kids and priorities, prioritizing family. What we think is important for kids, and does that mean that all the time, everyone, we're always connected in all those levels? Absolutely not.
Yes.
But there is a sort of container that one hopefully comes back to, where there is that alignment in those places.
So what I'm hearing is this is a hard working, hard is probably the wrong word, but it's a working relationship where you're actually creating a template, because up until the 1970s, it had never been even considered that relationships were a place of personal development. They were just, husband was the go out there, go and get it. The wife kept the house. And in some ways it was much simpler, but things have changed. And we're having to create the templates for a new type of relationship, which are genuinely supportive, connected, not Mickey Mouse. Of course, you go through stuff where you're not connected, and then you have to deal with your own stuff as well. But I'm hearing that's one of the places in which you've had to develop yourself, and you're in process of developing yourself.
Yeah, I think so. Both, and also both my wife and I, both of our parents got divorced. So neither of us had a model of mum and dad staying together sort of through relationship. Both of us had complex stuff in sort of family dynamics. You know, for me, and even certainly working on one's relationship is really important. I'd say an even bigger challenge is parenting. It's like, it's and again, going back to that point around adversity and struggle, like I was I was very pushed as a child. So I had a very dominating grandmother. My mum worked 3 jobs. She wasn't really available, particularly during, when I was a kid. So my grandmother sort of stepped in and filled that role. And my in many ways she was extraordinary. I mean, it was my grandmother that sort of left out copies of Dan Millman's Way of the Peaceful Warrior and Louise Hay, you Can Heal Your Life, that I read at 18 years old, that was like totally transformational. It was my grandmother that was taking me to naturopaths and nutritionists when I first got chronic fatigue in 1996. And so she was extraordinary in a lot of ways that it's taken me many years to come to appreciate. But she was also very, very much, you've got to be top of the class. If I was second in the class, who was top? Why wasn't it you? If I got 99 out of 100 in the test, it wasn't about the 99 that I got right. It was all about the one that I got wrong. And why did you get it right? So there was a lot of constant sort of pressure and push. And that's been a big part of my inner work, and how that sort of then became how I was in a relationship with myself, and a lot of work to unravel all of that. And so as a father, the last thing I want to be is the father that's pushing kids all of the time. Yeah. And then having kids that have challenges with neurodiversity that are not like our eldest, reading and writing took many years because of the severity of some of these challenges. And so it's like, but then not being so hands off that it's like we can just do what you want, and it doesn't matter. So like the constant inquiry of where those edges are, and realizing that great parenting is not about just trying to give children a happy childhood. This has been one of my really big reflections recently. Great parenting is preparing children for adulthood in a crazy world. And how do you build those resources, and how do you help them develop those capacities? And I don't know how I'm doing. We're going to find out. And as you know from your experience, you can give all of the heart, and you can also have a child that just comes in such a way that they're sort of destined to struggle in certain ways. And that's also, we have very dear friends of ours that have, I from what I know of your situation, and it's not a failure of the parents. I don't want to make this about sort of good and bad parents, but it's like, it's a, as you know better than anyone, it's a tough ground of self-development.
It is, and it's grown me, and I think that's what's interested me in this series, is that I found that the adversity I went through in losing my daughter was actually it's almost like an evolutionary trigger that actually woke me up and forced me to take a look at my relationship with my other children, that forced me to take a look at my life and where I was going. And I'm hearing that adversity, you and I probably share that quite a lot. In fact, we've talked on the same platform before around things like this. But what I'm hearing is that there's a consciousness, and I think this is the key, the consciousness that stops you from just being swamped by the terribleness of life sometimes, the horrendous things that can happen to us, and the inevitability for people like you and I to find a way forwards that's healthy. It's almost like opening a door that hasn't been opened before. And I know that you did that a lot in your work, and I was incredibly impressed with the documentary you made. And we won't go into great detail about this, about Andrew Cohen, but it was a very interesting documentary about a really tricky subject that I found riveting and fascinating, because there was consciousness in the exploration of the subject. And again, without going into an enormous detail, I just wonder if you can say something about that, for example.
Yeah, let me just contextualize it just briefly for those that may not know who Andrew Cohen is. So Andrew Cohen was, or is, he would say, but back in the day, a very well-known spiritual teacher. I guess I'm trying to think about the timeline here. Sort of probably the late 80s. I might have got that slightly wrong. I was I knew every detail about this about 10 years ago. But he built, he was an Advaita teacher, I guess what you would say was probably the sort of background. And he had some really good stuff, and he had some very toxic stuff. I think you could put it bluntly to say, had not worked his own shadow, had a sort of claimed enlightenment. His teacher claimed enlightenment for him as well. And a lot of people were drawn to him, and they were drawn to the work. And I think part of what drew a lot of people to him is that he was an uncompromising sort of radical in the way that you've got to go all in terms of your spiritual path. And if that had got to me at a certain point, I probably would have bought into that as well, which is why I was so fascinated by him and by the subject. And in a way, there is something that's extraordinary when you get hundreds of people together, and waking up is the most important thing that everyone is committed to doing. And so he drew in some incredibly impressive people, very sincere seekers, people that, almost like the creme de la creme of people that are really want to go for it in this lifetime in terms of kind of waking up and growing up and doing spiritual work. And many of those in that community will say they had some of the best experiences of their lives. They also had some horrendously bad experiences as well. And in the end, those power dynamics sort of turned in on themselves. And things down to, absolute power and control over people, deciding what relationships people could be in, people shaving their heads, doing thousands of prostrations in sort of worship of sort of him. And then it got really dark in some ways, of kind of financial kind of extortion, control of people. People nearly died in some of the sort of things they had to do in sort of service and sacrifice and so on. So the whole thing fell apart. And actually part of how it fell apart, which is to me an interesting part of the story, was that a bunch of the ex-students that had sort of been ostracized from the community started connecting in Facebook groups. So that kind of example of how social media can do good as well as it can do bad. And they'd all been sort of cut off from each other. But they started to share experience. Oh God, that happened to me. Oh my God! But he told me that's what happened. And so they started to sort of unravel all of this. So they challenged him. He stood down. I think it was forced to step down. And then the whole thing sort of imploded. And about 3 years later, 2, 3, 4 years later, he wrote a couple of public letters in an attempt to sort of, a cynic might say, to try and find his way back in. A kind of perspective might be to try and take some ownership and responsibility of his actions and what happened. And I read those letters and I was really curious. And at the time, I as a sort of, always being the optimist, I really wanted to believe that this was the sincere truth, that someone had this all-powerful position, had done some horrendous things, and was genuinely interested in a path of reconciliation and a path of healing. And so I approached him via some mutual friends to invite him to participate in this documentary series. And we filmed the series. We filmed with him. We filmed with harsh critics of his, of people that still supported him, and attempted to toe a very careful line of just trying to find the truth, like what's really the truth of the situation. And it was fascinating, also as someone who, in a sort of more kind of modest way, has a teacher role. And for me, it was a really interesting exploration of like, well, how do one hold, like when one becomes a teacher, you do have a certain amount of authority. People project things onto you, good, bad. People give over agency when they shouldn't. And how do you navigate and sort of, I think you should always give that agency back to people rather than to use that to weaponize. And I had an interesting sort of journey with my relationship with Andrew, which, he might tell a different story to what I would tell. But that was a very fascinating experience for me, for sure. And I should say I don't know if I told you this, but in the end, it did get sold. We eventually got sold to BBC Select. So it's actually now on Amazon Prime, pretty much around the world. It's also on YouTube. You can just search How I Created a Cult on YouTube, and the distributor who bought it has made it available on YouTube as well. So it's out there to watch.
I think it's extraordinary. I think it's also very interesting that in some ways you're treading, you talk about humbly treading, but I think that you're definitely treading a path where you are becoming pretty well known as a teacher. Now that's not always a blessing, and it's that's something that can trip us up. And I think the thing I remember most clearly about that documentary was one of the Roshis who you had on there saying, "I knew Andrew was in trouble when he said he had no shadow."
Yeah.
And that sort of hit me like an arrow. And I think there's something about, if we're going to take the path of responsibility for educating others in their lives, we have to watch the part of ourselves that wants to aggrandize and grow. And I know that you've worked a lot with it. You've done a lot of work with an organization that I was also involved with, Ridwan, the Diamond Heart approach, and done a lot of practice. And I wonder how that's happening for you now as your work develops, as you're becoming pretty well known in this environment. Are you managing to keep, it's not about keeping your ego squashed and not having an ego. It's about, are you managing to navigate your ego and your service, really would be the question I'd ask.
It's a good, interesting question. I had it's funny, it's a fun conversation. I think you ask these kind of questions. That's an interesting reflection. I had a period where so I think there are two problems you can have. Well, there's lots of problems, but there are two problems relating to this. One is where people become too inflated and too grandiose. But there's another challenge people can have, is where they actually play small and people actually hide their power and they don't step into their power. And that was my issue for a while, particularly around the time of producing this. I was like, I just want to be the furthest I can possibly be from that. So I'll do everything opposite to that. So that can be a challenge where one is actually holding oneself back and not stepping into one's gifts and one's potential. And I've really tried to work at that over recent years, and to try to not overstretch and to not sort of get overinflated, but also to not play small when I feel I have something that I have potential to do. A couple of things that have been very helpful to me. One is my wife, family. My wife, is very loving and supporting, but she's not interested in my ego. In fact, when we first got
down at your feet, Alex.
we first got together, it was the thing she liked least about me was when I go to sort of narcissistic moments of self-grandiosity. And so it's almost like I inhabit that place and she energetically just withdraws. And so that's been a kind of helpful thing. But the other thing that's been helpful for me, and and it sort of happened a little bit by accident in some ways, but most of our good friends, like the people that my wife and I hang out with, are really good people that are not really in this world. They're people that in the world of spirituality, self-development, and so on. They're people that we've mostly got to know because of the kids, because they've got kids the same age. And it's really hard as a couple for us to hang out with people that don't have kids if we're going to spend significant time together, because the kids are like, what am I meant to be doing? And so it's been really good to just have people that, I think most people that we know in our day-to-day life think that what I do is run businesses, and that is part of what I do. And every so often, for some reason, they'll come across something in my kind of more teaching work, and they're like, I didn't even know that you did that. And I'm like, well, that's kind of intentional, because I don't want to be in that role when I'm not in that role, if that makes sense. I want to just enjoy people and enjoy being around them, and not feel like I'm being a therapist or a teacher or someone that's supposed to be wise and whatever. And that's been very, very healthy for me. I really enjoy just walking the dogs, hanging out, going to live music, and not trying to get narcissistic supplies of being in some kind of role, which, I love my work, but I don't want my work to define me.
That's very good. Because I think there's a there's a real danger with all the positive, and there's also the negative projection that comes as well, but that's often further down the line. When you're a teacher, when you're doing your thing, running groups, doing sessions, or whatever it is, people tend to elevate you into the place of, this is a really wise man. And there's a danger this is a danger that I encountered in the work that I was doing. There's a danger that I then thought, this is who I am. And so when I went back to my wife and children, it's like, can't you see that actually I'm an extraordinary human being? But actually what they saw was a pompous ass who actually was just that, had one reality there and couldn't translate it into the home. And what I'm hearing with you is the translation, that actually you're finding the way to meld the worlds together without either of them compromising the other.
Yeah, I had an experience in my so when I mentioned I had my journey with ME chronic fatigue, and then I wrote a book about that. I set up the clinic, and I had a lot of self-esteem and self-worth issues at that time. I'd got sick at 16, having been very low self-confidence, very bullied at school, and then I sort of had this sort of persona that I'd sort of created. And then in my sort of early mid-20s, I was offered my own TV series by the BBC. I had a clinic in Harley Street. I had a penthouse apartment. And so my whole identity was hanging off trying to be this person.
Mm.
And then I started suffering from very severe anxiety, panic attacks, because I just it took so much energy to sustain all of that. So there was a kind of big breakdown process, which is when I got very serious about the diamond approach that you mentioned, that I was sort of very, very seriously involved in for about 10, 12 years. Um, and so as I sort of then, for want of a better way of putting it, sort of came back into a teacher role. So for that period, you know, I kept building the clinic, and I built sort of the early parts of Conscious Life, but I was quite careful not to put myself out there too much. I did the minimum that I could get away with to keep things moving forwards, but didn't want to step beyond that. And so in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, as I've started to gradually kind of really step back into that role, I still have a very clear nervous system wound from doing it the wrong way. And just, you know, it's like it's a drug that, like all drugs, can be really dangerous if you don't use it in moderation and use it the right way.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm hearing you've got quite a lot of checks and balances in your family, and also in the work that you did with Conscious Life TV, where you were interviewing some of the like I do, interviewing some of the big celebrities in that world and seeing that they've actually got feet of clay.
Well, that you and I've had some very interesting conversations over the years, and obviously we're very careful about how we tread on this over the
Yeah,
next
of
few minutes
course.
if we go there. But yes, that's part of it. When, you know, they say don't meet your heroes. There's and I've, like you, have pretty much met everyone in some degree, sometimes very briefly, sometimes more substantively. But, you know, have had commercial interactions with a lot of these people. So, you know, managing sort of contracts, and, you know, we've worked with through, you know, just like you have done over the years, through, you know, pretty much everyone. And some people have been incredibly impressive and, you know, very good, kind-hearted, decent human beings. And a lot of people, there's been quite a gap between the person that's on stage and the person that you've interacted with when they're not on stage. And I
Yeah.
always found that quite disappointing. And, you know, I remember one guy, so sort of, it was a story that really sort of stuck with me. A guy that we went to interview, a guy called Dr. Roger Walsh, who's sort of known in the integral community. And we were in San Francisco doing a series of interviews, and he and his wife had moved out a couple of hours out of downtown San Fran. So we drove out to go and film with him at home. And he'd organized lunch, little touches, organized lunch. So we had to go and get the gear out of the car. He said, "Oh, come and help." He said, "Oh, no, don't, please, no, it's fine. We're going." And he comes down, he's carrying camera bags, and he's carrying stand. And it was just the sort of sense of, this guy's invited us to his home to film, and we're guests, and we're being treated as guests that are being welcomed into the home, and nothing's too much trouble in terms of just human to human helping. And then I sort of compare that to some other situations, and how, not necessarily how I've been spoken to, because I've had some authority apparent, but how my team has sometimes been spoken to by people.
Yes.
And that's just really sat with me, that it's what is most impressive to me is not the size of someone's social media or how many book sales they have. It's the human that is living their life. That's what I find inspiring, and that's what I've tried to cultivate in my own life. But I really don't think I get to be the judge of how well I've done that. But that's certainly what I've aspired to, is how you treat, and also how you treat people when no one's looking, and when you don't have to treat them well. I would say you do, but that's what really interests me.
I think that's really good. And I remember studying for quite a long time with Ramdas, which was a real blessing.
I bet,
And
yeah.
he talked about something called transmission. And he said that the real teachers transmit. And I was very aware of that when I was running alternatives. And I was watching the people who were doing their song and dance act, and some very clever sort of ego-centered sort of like ways of winning the audience through entertainment, as I looked at it in those days. And the people who actually were deeply in service and had found something in themselves. And I think we're works in progress. I mean, I think if we're going to be teachers, if we're going to develop ourselves, I've watched someone like Eckhart Tolle, who's spoken for us a number of times, And I think something genuinely happened for him,
Mm.
where it's almost like he's transcended something that I've seen very, very rarely elsewhere. But ultimately, I think that we are constantly in the place of having to overcome our ego needs and gratifications and to be the best human we can be. And I see, and I know very much from the conversations we've had, that seems very much in alignment with your thinking as well.
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways that I think about it is, what often motivates people on what we call it a spiritual journey or inner work, whatever we want to call it, is for nearly all of us, that initial motivation is we're suffering and we want to get out of suffering, right? We want to reduce the amount of physical pain or emotional pain or psychological pain that we're experiencing. And then often what we start to believe is that the way we're not going to suffer is we're going to get to some kind of enlightened or awakened state. Like we have some story or some idea of like what that's going to be. And so the work becomes about trying to get there. But having had the privilege of meeting a number of people that have got to some kind of state,
Mm.
you then have to ask the question, well, what next? It's like, okay, so someone has temporarily, maybe in a more stable way, but they've had an insight or they've had a deepening of understanding of deeper truths. But who cares? Like, does it matter? Does it matter? Like, like if you're still going to be an asshole, does it matter? And it's like, it's one of the things that I find interesting these days. We did an event on psychedelics earlier in the year, and it's not something that's been a part of my personal path, but I do have respect for that work. And I have a number of friends of mine who had some very, I would say, helpful and positive experiences. But the ability to have a glimpse or an experience of something is not the same as stabilizing that thing. Like you can have a glimpse and then, whatever. But even if it is stabilized, surely it still matters who we are day to day, like how we treat the people around us. Like, is our impact in our life a positive one? And having had awakened experiences or someone having had glimpses or whatever, like if all they've done with that is had that and now think they're more superior than they've had it, one could argue they've gone backwards, not forwards.
I think that's spot on. Um, it's interesting because I've had the opportunity to be with people like, do you know, Irina Tweedy, the Chasm of Fire?
No.
So she used to run meditation groups, and she was in her 80s. And we'd go around to her house and we'd have visions. I mean, people would lie on the floor and they'd have visions. And I took that as normal. I was in my early 20s, and there was the normalcy of having extraordinary visions. But what I watched was her incredible kindness. And what I watched was all of her interactions were so caring. And I watched this 80-year-old grandmotherly type woman who was incredibly wise teach me about kindness. And I think the Dalai Lama's statement, "My religion is kindness," is one of the most profound statements there is. And when my dad died, I said in my eulogy, the Dalai Lama said, "My religion is kindness," and on that basis, my dad was a very religious man, and I really like that whole concept of kindness that we're exploring now. So we're coming towards the end of our our time together. It's really good to see you again. And the question I always ask at this stage is, what's the particular dragon you've had to slay in order to become who you are? And I want it absolutely spontaneous, so I haven't prepped you for it.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I'm thinking it feels like it's a question that has quite a few layers to the answer. Um, is it? I don't know if it's a dragon, but the thing that came immediately to mind, um, the place that I've always felt has been my compass, has been committing to truth. But sometimes that's really hard. Sometimes it's really inconvenient. Sometimes it means making really difficult, painful life choices. And so if there's a dragon to be slayed, I suppose it's the dragon of sort of false truths, or the dragon of my ego. There's the comfortable path where one might be able to sort of hide behind a sort of mask or whatever. The thing that I've really tried to do, and I continue to try to do, is to really find those shadows and stare at them and look at them and try to, and enter them and try to understand them. And sometimes something I meant to say a bit earlier when we were sort of in some of this territory, that sometimes when life is really, really hard, like we're really doing the hard stuff, I think about those times and I look back on them and I go, at least I was alive. Like life was really happening. And you know, the thing that to me I always feel sort of heavy-hearted about is when life's all a bit too mediocre and be sort of a bit asleep and just sort of going through doing the same thing day after day, week after week, year after year, and nothing really changes, and if we sort of leave it as sort of maybe a parting message to people, it's like when it's really hard and we really show up to the hard stuff, like we're really doing the best we can to do the work. That's often when the real magic happens. And that's also when, as well, I look back on some of those times in my life. And I just think I mentioned the conversation I had with my uncle, and it's like, it's just by the grace of God. So, I don't have a better way of putting it, that the right person turns up or the right conversation happens, or we're in the library and the book literally falls out and hits us in the face. And it's like, but we have the courage to pick it up and read it, and it's like,
Yeah.
that's when we're really alive.
It's funny, you just talked about a book falling out. I was with some friends in Spain, and we were in this sort of fancy spa, and I walked into the library there, and the book fell out of me, and it was Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. And
Yeah,
I went, my God, this man has actually shown what the spiritual path might look like, and it was a brilliant part of my education.
that's beautiful. Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much. I'm really, really grateful for you to come and be with us here today, and we'll let you have um, the blurb and the playlist, the playback of all this, and really appreciate you coming, and really good to see you after quite a number of years as well. So,
Well,
uh,
thank you for having me. It's nice to have a conversation where we was having a conversation. I really appreciate your questions, and I always enjoy our time. And we need to make more time to hang out. So it's been lovely to see you.
that'd be brilliant. Thanks a lot. All the best then.